Hi, and welcome to Serenity in Leadership series on leading responsibly with integrity and purpose. A series dedicated to conversations with people who are shining examples of this kind of leadership. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Anita Nowak, who is a leading authority on empathy. Anita is a Montreal native and holds a doctoral degree from McGill University, where she was named Professor of the Year in 2014 and 2019. She's an author, facilitator, and sought-after speaker, and has held a variety of leadership and advisory roles. She's also volunteered for many social purpose organizations over the past 20 years, both locally and internationally. Welcome, Anita. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Thom. There's mutual admiration. I'm so excited to be on your podcast after you run mine.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's go into this. Knowing what I know about you, Anita, your message seems remarkably simple. The world needs more empathy, but is it really that simple? And what does empathy actually mean to you?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me answer the second question in a minute, because the first question, it is that simple. The world needs more empathy. And I look at it sort of like on three dimensions. If you think about one of the things I do with my students every semester that I teach is that I invite them to join me on a spaceship. And I say, okay, we're coming from another part of the planet, part of the universe, and we're doing anthropology. Okay, so let's say January 2023, we land surreptitiously on the planet and we pick up some data points. And of course, I recognize that humanity, so Homo sapiens on planet Earth, have used their ingenuity and creativity to accomplish a lot of stuff. So, I've got some data points on that, but it would be impossible not to also pay attention to some of the things that I think they're getting wrong. I think we are getting wrong. So, for example, right now we have, it's estimated by the International Labor Organization, is about 27 million modern day slaves. And slavery has been abolished by all countries on the planet. And yet that number represents 3 times the number of people who were exploited through the 300-year African slave trade. And some of them are children. So I'm thinking, okay, that's problematic. You could see that 1 billion people practice open defecation on the planet with massive public health consequences. Same thing, 1 billion people don't have access to safe drinking water. And then you see what we're doing to the planet, right? With biodiversity loss and climate change. And who is being impacted most by climate change? The people who contributed least to the problem and the people who have the least means of mitigating the impacts. So just, from those data points, and there are many, many others. Oh, another I should say is you've got 8 men, as it were, who have the same combined wealth as the bottom 4 billion people on the planet. And that's just atrocious to me. That's morally unjust. And I just think we could be organizing ourselves differently. And the lack of empathy is very obvious when you think of it that way. And even in our organizations, people feel a lack of purpose. They feel sometimes they're in toxic workplaces where there's harassment and bullying and overwork and stress and people, the blurring of the lines between workplace and life now, especially post-COVID or during COVID. So there's a lack of empathy there. And in our personal lives, there's a lack of empathy. Our relationships are eroding across political and ideological divides. We're spending so much screen time away from, it's against human nature, actually, for us to not be in more communion with one another. We're just becoming more and more alienated from one another. And there's massive mental health consequences. So all that to say, Thom, the world needs more empathy, and it is that simple. And we must do something about it. Now, what is empathy? You asked what is empathy? So the way I came to study empathy was not because I had an immediate interest in empathy right off the bat. It was actually because I did interviews for my doctoral degree with change makers, with social entrepreneurs. These are the people who work with the same entrepreneurial toolbox as regular entrepreneurs, but they're addressing a social or an environmental problem. And I was curious about them. I was trying to understand, how can we educate the next generation of change makers? So let me understand this generation of change makers better. So through interviews with them, I discovered a lot, but one of the things that I discovered is that they see, a group of people that are suffering or marginalized or exploited or harmed in some way by a social problem like poverty or mental health or some kind of illness or racism. I was agnostic to the issue, but they all felt compelled to act, right? So I called it empathic action. And through realizing the power of empathy, I started to really go deep into like, okay, what is empathy and how is it different from things like sympathy and pity and compassion? And I've come to see empathy as a really important innate trait that we have that unites us in our common humanity. So when you pity somebody, you look down on them, there's power asymmetry embedded in the relationship. Oh, you poor person. But across this continuum of sort of altruistic emotions, empathy is powerful because it allows us to see our common humanity. And when we empathize with someone in that way, where we feel like kinship and connection to the person, sense of interdependence, then it becomes powerful because you feel motivated to do what you can. And that's why I really care a lot about purposeful empathy. Like, we have the capacity to empathize, but let's do it on purpose. So, yeah, I think empathy is the second most powerful force on the planet, second only to love.
And corporations have resisted love for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
So I truly believe that potentially mental health is the next pandemic. Indeed, one could argue we're already in it. Do you think empathy may be the answer?
The answer, I won't go that far. I'll say an important part of the answer, yes. I think so if we look back at history, it's evolutionary scientists that tell us some 40,000 years ago, there were 4 or 5 other large brain mammals roaming the earth alongside Homo sapiens. But we are the species that lived, survived, and thrived, and they died off. And when they do research about why is it that we survived, they've come to the conclusion that it's because we worked together collaboratively and that we were empathic. So the whites of our eyes are extremely big. We have the biggest whites of any mammal on the planet right now. And that was to be able to read each other's eye expressions, right? You can imagine being at an office meeting, having a glance with somebody, you haven't said a word, and all you needed to do was glance at that person and you knew where that person stood on an issue. You could communicate. So we have that capacity. Our facial hair fell off to the large extent so that we could read each other's facial expressions better. So there's just so many physiological things that happen to us that would give indication that we had to communicate and signal to one another how we were feeling so that we could work together to survive against the elements. So it's part of who we are to be together and work collectively and collaboratively. And that's splintering in our society. And in workplaces, there's so many systems at play and so many, whether it's the deliverables of the KPIs and the pressure to perform, so much of that, and then just the constant grind of working and not necessarily having always a job that brings you great purpose and meaning. I think it's come to define who we are as human beings, that we're workers, human doings as opposed to human beings. And so I think and of course, we're working within a system that is competitive by nature and extractive by nature. And I think we've lost touch with sort of something really important about what it means to be human. And so I think it's done a real number on our mental health. And if we were able to focus more of our attention on our capacity to empathize and be in communion and in relation with other people, we would realize how healing it is to us as a organism.
Yeah.
There's real research that shows when you're in empathic embrace, our brain lights up the same pleasure and reward centers as get lit up when we're having great food, great sex. I'm not sure how they study that, but that's what they say. Even psychedelic drugs, right? Like the high that we feel when we're in pleasure, we actually feel that when we're in an emotional, empathic connection with somebody. So that's one indication. But then also there's so much that happens in our bodies. They say our heart rate stabilizes, our immune system functions better. So there's just a whole bunch of things that are beneficial to us and our mental health when we do extend and are in emotional resonance with other people.
Thank you. I understand that you argue empathic action can be a powerful disruptive force for social good. Does that mean that businesses need to move from achieving objectives and focusing on profit to concentrating more on engagement, inclusivity, and well-being as a measure of workplace success?
So I think once upon a time, there was a big social contract between companies, corporations, the private sector, and the citizenry and the public sector. And that over time, through many, many decades of neoliberalism, has been grinded down. So, I understand that capitalism allows for great innovation and allows for the flow of goods and products and services. But I think that right now, capitalism is literally taking us off a cliff. You just have to look at climate change and the fact that we're just still thinking about GDP, thinking about growth, this constant growth mindset on a finite planet. It just mathematically doesn't compute.
Yes.
And so I think, there are a lot of people that are trying to figure out how do we move away from the modality of extractive and predatory capitalism to something where the social contract can be that we can find a sweet spot, right, and coexist. So social businesses, a la Mohammed Yunus is a good example, but all B Corps. I don't know how big the B Corp movement is in the UK, but when you understand the principles of B Corps, it's that they exist and they do make a profit, but they don't do that without regard for the social, environmental, and governance consequences. And I think we need to hold ourselves to a higher level of account because of the social contract, but also because of our progeny. Like, what kind of world are our children and grandchildren inheriting? And shouldn't we have a little more empathy for the generations down the line? So I think that companies, and it's interesting, I get asked a lot of times when I give corporate talks, but we're a high performance culture. How can we possibly integrate the lovely thing called empathy? And I say, if you don't, you won't be high performance, because high performance requires agility, open communication, innovation. And what greases that wheel? Social capital, right? When you work with somebody that you trust, you can go faster. You forgive each other when you've had a bad day or if something gets misunderstood. So there's tons of costly externalities to having a toxic work environment or an unempathic work environment. And you have one where there's an empathic culture where everybody comes feeling like they can be their authentic, complicated human selves to work, and they won't be judged for it or penalized for it. They can be slightly more creative and risk-taking and innovative, and people help each other out. And that's how the social capital gets built. And then you can have high performance cultures. So they're not mutually exclusive at all. And I think leaders who are leaning into empathy are going to benefit in the long run.
So how do you persuade those leaders who, they hear your logic, but somehow they don't do anything about it? In just the same way as we've got climate change and all the imbalance that there is in the world. So how do you get to them?
Well, there's real research showing that it matters to KPIs. It matters to sales and performance, and it reduces cost on turnover, absenteeism, presenteeism, like a whole bunch of actual hard data that it costs more. But here, I have 5 things to say about that, like to make the case to leaders. Okay.
Yeah.
So the first is, and we all know this, Thom, okay? Professionals are flat out exhausted. They're exhausted from the crushing workload and digital overload, okay? That they endured during the pandemic and still continues, okay? It all took a toll on their mental health. Nearly 1 in 3 American adults, I don't know what's going on in Europe and the UK, have reported symptoms of anxiety and or depression during the pandemic, and that's like way up from pre-COVID. Burnout rates shot to all-time highs across all professions, and women and racialized people were disproportionately impacted. Okay, so we need to have psychologically safe places at work, okay? Just because people are suffering. That's the first one. The second one is that people have had epiphanies about family time and what it means to do remote work versus commuting, thinking about their passion projects, their own mortality, their life's purpose. And what has that led to? What's known as the Great Resignation, right? So the war for talent is real. In 2021, right, Deloitte did a study, 6 out of 10 CEOs believe that attracting talent is going to be one of their company's biggest challenges in the future, and you want to attract the talent of the youngest generation, you have to pay special attention to their needs. So employees want to work for organizations that have more empathic cultures. So that's the second. The third is there's no getting around the need for more equity, diversity, and inclusion in workplaces. It's a top priority for workers, okay? And leaders can't pay lip service to it anymore. Companies are rightfully being called upon to leverage their assets and their power and their influence to contribute to systemic change that's needed. So, there is a need for more empathy training, more training about what it means to have inclusive environments. So that's the third reason. Then, no surprise, Gen Z has an entirely different set of values, right? Yeah. So, and I know this because I've been teaching, 20 somethings for the last decade, and it is astounding to me how different the set of values are. So there are 60 million members of Gen Z that are going to be entering the workforce in the US alone, okay? So everywhere that's happening. And they're going to be beginning their careers, and they are going to transform the workplace because they have different values and expectations and goals. They do not believe in power over structures, okay? They just don't believe in this. Yeah. They want to work collaboratively. They want to work with authenticity in mind. With it, sustainability matters to them, and EDI matters to them. Okay, that's the fourth and final one, is that, the idea that you can go to work and be yelled at and be called out publicly with no consequences, those days are over. Okay, so it used to be also that you could go to work and you could fraternize with your colleagues, right, across different party lines. Now we're seeing political polarization. All the way up to the C-suite, right? With massive problems with mediation costs and all sorts of things. There's the us versus them hostile environment that exists out in the public is happening in the workplace, and it's expensive. And we have to find ways to build bridges of understanding in the workplace. So all of that requires empathy, all of it. We need empathic leaders, empathic cultures for all of those reasons.
I love what you say. I'm so in resonance with it all, and I just so agree. It's just you're a little bit more fluent than me in the way that you describe things. It's interesting for me because as I look at this, and I particularly around harassment of women, for instance, it feels like there's a backlash. You get the Donald Trumps and the Boris Johnsons of the world who express that, and now you've got Andrew Tate, who's got this massive following of young men preaching a very simple message in a very complex environment, but people are loving it. Well, a lot of people are really appreciating that. And I see that as part of the pushback, that we don't need to be empathetic. Real men aren't empathetic. They go out and they fight and they win battles. And I think it's resonating with a lot of particularly young men, for instance, that message.
So a lot to say about that, and it's all tricky kind of terrain. I think simple answers, like, oh, I have the answer to your big problem, those kind of facile answers really allow populism to kind of flourish, right? Because communicators and politicians who have capacity for rhetoric will seize onto a fear that someone might have, and a fear that many people might share, and find an easy scapegoat to point at and say, well, they're the reason why you can't achieve all that you need to achieve, right? So, when workers that were typically maybe protected by unions, when companies who are manufacturing in America, and I imagine in the UK the same thing, when everything was offshoring, people lost jobs, they lost stable incomes. That's very threatening. That's destabilizing to tens of thousands and millions of people. And so then you can point your finger to the other. And the politicians spin it as that, when in reality you should be looking at, well, look, it's the corporate decision to make more money. Yeah. Like, why don't we go after them and not the other people? So I think women are being blamed, possibly because a lot of men are not pursuing higher education. And it used to be that higher education was the gateway to a better paying job. And therefore you could, attract the right kind of woman, because back in the day, she would marry to have sort of the financial stability that came with that. And over time, as more women have entered the workforce and more women enter higher education, they are able to be more independent. So that's very, very destabilizing for an entire generation of men. And then they can point the finger. So I think the younger generation have sort of a real, they understand what justice means. They understand what equity means. And I think they also are prepared, at least the students I'm coming across, to share power in a different way. And that's why I have a lot of hope. But in the interim, over the next few years, it's going to be really dicey. Yeah,
and of course, at the systemic level, if you look at what's happening in Afghanistan and Iran, for instance, that's the extreme. But I do see it as a systemic thing. So let's just hope it's short-lived. You talk a bit about empathy in the age of AI. How well can the two rub along together?
Okay, so AI, artificial intelligence, is coming. I mean, it's already here, but it's going to continue to be more pervasive and ubiquitous in our lives. And so how different is it in terms of other technologies that have kind of revolutionized humanity? And I remember coming across something and even writing about it in my book, that if you think of the Gutenberg printing press back in the 1400s was invented, and we can point to that being sort of one of the early technologies that allowed empathy to flourish in the world, because texts were typically produced for religious scholars in Latin. And once the printing press made printing accessible, where you could produce books, all of a sudden people who were living in villages, who didn't have access to other ideas from outside their village for the most part, all of a sudden had access to books and literacy, and could read about the lives of other people from around the world and challenge the ideas of what were in those canon texts. That's, people point to, that's what started the Protestant Revolution, right? So I think technology can be a powerful force. I mean, we're talking on Zoom right now, and we're using technology. I appreciate technology quite a bit. So I don't want to be like an anti-tech person right out of the gates. I think technology can be very useful. I see the applications of AI in education, and how we could create tailored learning for different learning styles. Wonderful. I think AI is going to be super helpful in the healthcare profession in many, many, many places. It's going to improve our lives. I think for me, where I worry, there's two places. One is human beings are creative, and we can create all sorts of like innovative, interesting solutions to problems. But because big technology companies with deep, deep, deep pockets working within the paradigm of predatory capitalism, a lot could go wrong with AI. So I worry about whether or not there are enough checks and balances, and if those checks and balances are strong enough to withstand the pressures of the race for AI and profit within that space. So that's one thing. On a human level, I worry about how it's going to further erode our relationships. When I think specifically about sex, there are AI tech bots right now that can perform up to 50 sexual acts. And there are androids that are being created with the texture of skin at the temperature of skin, where you can pre-order the kind of sex bot you want with not only the eye color and the breast size and all of that, but also, what language and what accents. And over time, the AI is going to actually, because they're going to be smart algorithms, if they start to have conversations with people, they'll be able to adapt to what a person will find funny. And, just like, why do people have dogs at home? Dogs are always welcoming of the person who owns the dog. So what's going to happen when you have a little android at home that's always welcoming you? That's a lot less complicated than having a partner at home who might be frustrated that you forgot to bring something home and they asked you to do it. So I guess I kind of worry about, how much we're going to substitute when AI gets so sophisticated that we're going to have a lot of our emotional and spiritual needs met by a machine without consciousness. So that kind of worries me.
And so it should, yes. And you already see it in old people's homes, and that they found that little robots, that are sort of cuddly and that people respond really, very positively to that. It's
entirely. And I think there's going to be a place for it, as there's, a massive number of people who are entering their kind of golden years, who are going to live long, but might not have mobility. So you'd like to have maybe some androids that could have conversations and keep people engaged, especially if somebody has, dementia or Alzheimer's and keeps repeating the same story, that maybe an android would be useful in that circumstance. I understand that having these little androids could be useful in terms of, having conversations with kids to improve their grammar and to read stories and to be sort of like a bit of a babysitter. But, I've read stories where there are robots being used with military personnel overseas, so that they have, kind of a friend that they can talk to. And sometimes some sand gets into the machine and the machine kind of breaks down. And I've read funerals for android bots out in the field because a soldier feels the loss of that machine. So yeah, I think as we anthropomorphize machines, it will have an impact on how we relate as human beings, and certainly will have some implications for empathy.
Yes, takes empathy to a different place, really. We're running out of time. Can I ask you one more question? I think most of us would agree that leaders need to, and post-pandemic, many are applying a more focused emphasis on their people. So how can leaders show empathy to improve the well-being of their employees, customers, and partners? What are the workplace solutions for how we can be more empathetic?
It's a great question. A lot to say about that. There's much to do, but I think I would put it on two key things. One is leaders need to have greater self-awareness about how they're feeling at any given moment.
Absolutely.
Because when you're busy reacting all the time and not paying attention to how you feel about an issue, you can't regulate how you react. because you're busy reacting. So for example, if let's say I'm a leader, I've just received an email about an important meeting that I have to do a presentation, which means I'm going to have to work over the weekend. I'm frustrated, or I've missed a KPI, whatever. Like I'm stressed. Okay, I'm stressed, and somebody comes into my office to request time off because they've had a miscarriage, for example. Can I be present for that person when I myself am triggered by my own anxiety? And leaders are constantly fretting about a bunch of different things. So I'm not saying that you can ever get this perfectly, but if a leader realizes that they're feeling stressed, and you can do a body scan, you can sense how you're breathing, you can learn to read the signals in your body about how you're feeling. You can make a decision with that self-awareness to say, okay, for this moment, I have to park that so that I can be present for someone else who works for me, with me, to meet their needs, and to be able to listen and be present and show some empathy. So that requires emotional intelligence, and your brain cannot be in a state of anxiety and empathy simultaneously. It's not possible. Our brains are not able to do that. So if you want to be able to empathize with somebody, you have to park the anxiety and the stress to be able to be open and allow empathy to flow. So one of the first things is self-awareness, learning your cues, learning what triggers you, and learning to downregulate. The second thing is to learn how to be a better listener. We as human beings are programmed, our brains are programmed to take in what we're hearing and immediately think about it. So we're reacting. We are busy preparing to respond. When you're listening to me, you're gauging whether you agree, disagree, what does that connect to, what does that remind you of, and you're not in as listening mode as you think you might be. And so you can actually practice becoming a better listener, what's called holding space for people to be able to share, where you're not in your own brain thinking about how that connects to anything that matters to you, to be able to hold the place with non-judgment so that you can hear what someone is saying. And because when we hear things, we're emotionally triggered all the time. Like if you think about it in your own personal life, Thom, when has it ever happened that you've had an argument with anybody, a spouse, a partner, a kid, a friend, where you've been busy trying to understand what they're saying? No, you're busy preparing on how you're going to respond. So I think the second key leadership skill to become more empathic is to become a better listener.
I think we've run out of time. Anita, this is just so wonderful to hear your ideas, your thoughts, how complete your thinking is in a sense. Mind you, as a teacher, I guess that's part of your skill. It's wonderful to hear you be your clarity. But before we go, tell me about your book. Tell people about your book coming out.
So first of all, thank you, Thom, for those kind words. And thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. It's such a pleasure. You've held the space for me beautifully and asked such really compelling questions. My book is called Purposeful Empathy, Tapping Our Hidden Superpower for Personal, Organizational, and Social Change. And the goal that I have with the book is to remind people that we are at an all hands on deck moment in humanity, that we need to elevate our collective empathy to save humanity. But that also it's not just about extending empathy because the needs are so dire. I also want to remind people something we know intuitively anyways, is that we all benefit when we do that. And wouldn't we want to live more meaningful, healthier, happier lives at home and at work? So it goes two ways. Let's become more empathic for our own benefit while we create a better world together. So it comes out April 11th, and you can pre-order it now on any of your favorite online retailers.
I've already ordered mine.
Thank you.
Anita, thank you. I'm really looking forward to reading it, actually. because I just so agree with the things that you're saying. This is a moment. I think we're going to struggle for a number of years yet, but the good will come through. That's my belief, that the good will come through. But those for whom the world is just fine now, I think will resist, and that's the bit that we've got to work through. So yes, Anita, thank you so much.
Thank you, Thom.